So I got a relatively cheap speaker thing that seems to work pretty all right. So we'll see. But Inez did a great job of doing this introduction, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. Although I will mention, like, costs a lot of money, 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 free. So, and this, a film made entirely in Blender just won like a number of awards. Like it was a movie called Flow about animals and a cat. It's a really beautiful movie done entirely in Blender. This, if you learn this really well, like more and more studios are adopting Blender, and it's becoming equivalent to the rest of these. And it's challenging. It takes a. I'm not going to gloss over the fact that it can be difficult to learn. But what we're going to learn today, using a tool that actually Unity acquired, and because it goes great with Unity, it allows you to do 3D in Unity. And even though you're going to quickly get to the point where you're going to outgrow it, it is the same basics. You create a 3D model, you're able to edit it by pulling the vertices and moving the edges and changing it and grabbing the faces, which we'll talk about what those things are. But the fundamentals are the same. So what you'll be learning today is directly transferable to stepping up to something like Blender or 3D Studio Max or Maya, stuff like that. So you create all kinds of stuff with this. You model, you texture the model so that it has some kind of like color or surface. You shade it. Shaders are ways to make it look different based on different physical properties. You light it. Rigging is like when you have a character, the skeleton that allows them to be moved and adjusted. Animating, rendering, compositing. In fact, Blender has developed so much that it's got like a built-in video editor, and it's got a built-in like image editor and all this other kind of crazy stuff. So really, you can do virtually everything you need to make a movie in Blender without ever leaving Blender. Although most people use other tools to support it. So let's see. I think that, why did that not go into the next thing? Aha. So just real quick, so we're going to be using ProBuilder, which used to have all of its tools in dedicated windows, but a bunch of stuff changed with it, and now this is it's actually become more difficult because now they're hiding the tools in various places. But let's go ahead and just get started by opening Unity's the Unity Hub. And so when you have the Unity Hub open, which I'm hoping it's doing, let's see. All right. So for some reason it asked me to sign back in. No, it's all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a new project. And we're going to use the universal 3D starting point because we're going to make 3D objects, and so it makes sense to start from the 3D point of view. We won't connect to the Unity Cloud, and you can name it whatever you like, but like class 3 3D modeling could be one way of naming it. All right, so then of course it'll take a moment once you press create project before it all comes up and starts rolling. While we're waiting for to get set up, does anybody have any questions about what you've seen so far? Any expectations, any things you hope we cover?
I think I did try to look into how to download ProBuilder. You mentioned packages. Is that the same? Is that the same as when we in the last class when we got the first-person camera?
Yes. So yeah, you can go to, for example, the Unity Asset Store. If that, and you can find things at the Unity Asset Store. But the thing is that even if you go to Unity Asset Store, all it does is say, okay, whatever you find, open it up in Unity and find it in Unity. This is essentially just a front end for what's really available in Unity through Unity's package manager. And so, for example, I think that if you were to look, if you were to look for ProBuilder here, it's probably going to tell you like you're not going to find it because it's now built into Unity, because you can get a lot of the things that there's a ton of things available in. So I bet it's not even going to show up here, although they're showing you things that are similar to. Here's a nice free prototype material that can be useful. But yeah, so you won't even find ProBuilder here, but then that's because it actually it is available through Unity, and there's a ton of other things that are easily available through the package manager in Unity. What's interesting about not only are individual tools like this available in Unity through the package manager, but sometimes they group them together. So there's, for example, there's a group of tools that you can find in the Unity package manager called the World Building Kit, I believe. And that gives you ProBuilder and like Polysculpt and some other tools, so that they sometimes say, okay, if you want to create cinematics, here's a group of tools that you may want to grab that will help it make it easier in Unity. So there's tons of things that aren't built into Unity. What they want to do is they want to make Unity lightweight so that when it'll run on a potato computer, so that it will like be quick to download and quick to set up, and then you just add this functionality as you need it. So for example, we did Text Mesh Pro is a prime example. It's kind of like the new standard for working with text. So mine is finally coming up here. So what I can do is I can just remove these README assets that I'm not going to need. And then I can walk you through, it may take you a second to get to the point where I'm at. But what you do is you go to Windows Package Manager, and it pops up over here on my other screen. But here you can see, all right, so you have the things that are already in your project. And so it's good to know, like, when I start from just an empty 3D project, I already have a bunch of these packages that come along with it. And if you don't need them, you could even get rid of them. I mean, I don't have JetBrains, so I don't need that. So there's things here that you don't necessarily need that you could strip out, but they don't really cause any problems, so I wouldn't recommend that too much. But so here in the Unity registry, this is what I was talking about. So you see that they have these groupings like the 3D world building package, or like the cinematics package, or making a mobile game or a VR game. And then they have the individual, tons of individual packages, and it just goes on and on. But if you select the 3D world building package, you'll see that it includes ProBuilder, Polybrush, the FBX exporter, which allows you to take whatever you make using ProBuilder and export it, and then the terrain tools. So let's just go ahead and install that. So it'll take a second, but then it'll bring you up that the UI that shows you all the things you're about to bring into your engine. Now, one thing to note is that you see it has an FBX exporter. It's really one of the smart ways to use ProBuilder is you use it to build something rough in Unity, and then you can actually export that model that you make in Unity, take it into Blender, make it look really good, and then bring it back in. And so that's a totally legitimate way of working. All right, so now Package Manager, where did you, did it actually add that? Surprise, maybe yeah, I guess it's in there now. It didn't give us one of those import windows, but if I look under Tools, now I can see I have ProBuilder and Polybrush. So is there anybody who isn't at this stage at this point? No worries. So you got that's a pretty lean ThinkPad you got there.
Yeah, but it's not a potato. I made sure it's like.
No worries. Well, what we'll do first, before we get into ProBuilder, is we'll set up. Go ahead and get your kind of layout of your setup here the way you'd like it. So for example, knowing that we're going to be working a lot here in the scene view, I might want to maximize on the amount of space I have there, kind of bring this down. Of course, other things is you might have different toolbars opened up than me. Remember, this is like your master toolbar here. This is the one that is the toolbar of toolbars that adds and removes all these other toolbars. And so it's totally okay if you've got, if these aren't currently visible. Like if I hide that. Oh, are you looking for the window package manager? Oh, it's already installed. Okay, then it will be under Tools ProBuilder if it's installed correctly. And so what I'll do first is turn on the, turn on the grid just to help us kind of make our space out. So that was this button here, this third one, grid and snap, and I click the first button here. Oh, we're not starting with ProBuilder just yet. What we're going to do before we open ProBuilder is, so we have our scene here, and we have nothing but a main camera, a directional light, and a global volume. So go ahead and get rid of that global volume just to reduce kind of any potential confusion, or just to get less stuff here. And let's do two things before we get into ProBuilder, which is first, we'll create a regular 3D cube here that we're going to call ground. And what I'm going to do is make that like maybe 50 by 50 by 1. Just something kind of big enough to be a workspace. And then the next thing I'm going to do is something that we did in the previous class, which is to get a sense of scale. It can be really useful to create that character size reference cube. So remember, we called this like char size ref, and we made it 2 high by 1 by 1. And if we put that, let's see, actually, if we put it in the middle and lift it up a little bit, actually, it's not 2, it's 1 by 2 by 1, my bad. So this is an approximation of the size of a character. And so now when we start making something, we have an idea of if our scale is even remotely close to sensible. Because otherwise we could make something and then get in there and realize it's either ginormous or ridiculously tiny, and then we'd have to do all kinds of additional work to get it. So if you're in the position where you have main camera, directional light, your ground, and your character size ref, then go ahead and save your scene, and now we have a starting point. And so now what we can do is we can go to Tools ProBuilder. I think we can even also just right-click here in the hierarchy, and it's put a ProBuilder category under where we see our regular 3D objects and other things. And so these are the ProBuilder primitives. So you'll see, with what's built into Unity, you can create cube, sphere, capsule, etc. You have a lot of that stuff in ProBuilder, but other stuff as well, like a built-in door, prisms, stairs. Like, you can, try this, like choose any of those, throw it into this and see that it'll create something in the scene. You might need to move, this up a bit. If I take my ground and I put it at 0, 0, 0, it might help this a little bit. And then move it down a little bit. All right. So for example, just right off the bat, I can create stairs with ProBuilder. I can create a door that, you see it's kind of missing some of the mesh, but the point is that you would build out from this. And so you can create some interesting shapes that you can't create, for example, this torus. You can't do this with regular Unity primitives. But the thing that is most interesting isn't the primitives that you can create with ProBuilder. It's that you use that primitive shape as the starting point to now create other shapes and other things that are interesting. So what I would say is actually let's delete any of these extras that you might make, and let's start with a humble cube. So, but it's a ProBuilder cube, and it makes it a little different. So you'd already see if you kind of zoom into it that it's got its own special texture that says prototype. It kind of helps give you an idea of the size of this thing. So now I'm going to jump back over to my presentation real quick, because what I want to do is I want to just show you really quickly something that's going to come into play here, which is it's useful to understand the difference between a vertex, an edge, and a face. So this is kind of like some of the fundamentals of 3D modeling, which is like, okay, faces are the actual, like the full polygon side, whereas the edge is, you know, the edge that connects two vertices. And so these are things you can manipulate in ProBuilder and in 3D in general. Is you're usually working, you're either dealing with the whole object, or you can go into an editing mode where you choose to work with either edges, vertices, or faces. And just like in regular Unity, what you're doing is you are scaling, moving, and rotating these things to change the shape. And there's other tricks that we can use as well. But the first challenge of working with ProBuilder is actually figuring out, well, how do I get access to be able to get to that stuff? Because it used to be in a separate menu, but now they've kind of hidden it in a way that even I've been stumbling over. But what you want to do is you want to open up this tools palette. And now when you open it up, it may appear up here, or it may be floating around here. I've gotten to the point where I like to kind of dock it over on the side, because these are so commonly used. And you still kind of want access to some of these things up here. But if you look closely, it looks a little different. There's two things that are different. There's this tool here and this section here that wasn't there before. And so what we can do is, you know, with this shape, it works just the same in terms of moving, you know, rotating and scaling the entire shape. And you can non-uniform, and then you can Control Z to get back. But what we want to do, we want to get to the point where we can edit the faces, the edges, and the vertices, because that's how we get into sculpting with 3D. And the way that we get started with that is to click this tool here, and then click, let's see, they hid it in one of these things. There it is. All right. So in the in your main toolbar, the second item is called Tool Settings. In order to see these three things, vertices, edges, and faces, you not only have to click this thing, but this Tool Settings thing has to be visible. So I can put that up here if I want to just have it nearby. You can put it in the the taskbar there. So now I can see that I have the ability to select these different things. So for example, if I select the vertex setting, vertex selection, you can see now when I mouse over the vertices and the corners of the cube, it turns yellow. If I click on it, so yeah, with your move tool selected and with a vertex selection selected, click on a vertex and see that now you can move that vertex. And of course, only the one vertex you have selected moves. But you can Control click to select another vertex, and now you're moving two vertexes together, vertices, or three, or however many you want. But it might be easier, instead of me clicking this vertex and then Control clicking this vertex to move these, instead what I can do is I can click edge selection and click on the edge between them. Now I'm doing kind of the same thing, but I'm moving the whole edge. And the same goes for the face selection. I can click on a face and I can move this face. You notice that the texture stays put, or actually expands, so you get an idea of like, okay, wait, if If this is one unit and I pull this out and then I see the other one, I now have roughly 2 units. But it works not just with move, but also with like rotate. It also works with scale. So you can see where you're starting to get the sense that like, okay, I can take a basic shape and I can rotate, move, scale. I can kind of deform it, and it almost is kind of like digital clay. So give yourself a little bit of an opportunity to experiment with this right now. Try selecting different faces, scaling things up. And you can also at any point, if you click this yellow part here again, you go back to the object control. So if you wanted to make the entire thing larger in object mode, then go in, select a face, and maybe pull that out over here to make this larger. The other thing that you should absolutely do on a regular basis when you're doing 3D modeling is make sure that you're orbiting around what you're doing, because it might look a certain way from your one perspective, and then you look at it from the back or the top and you realize, wow, it looks totally mangled from the other side. But you can see where, when you were creating gray boxes, you only had access to the basic Unity primitives, and you were able to do some interesting things with them. But this ability to create any kind of shape you want is going to give you a lot more potential to create a lot of more interesting things. It's a great way to quickly get shapes that you're looking for. When I worked at Flashbulb, the level designers would use ProBuilder to mock up spaces because it gave them more control, but still kept it simple and gray boxy when compared to using the Unity primitives. And then they can take those and export them and have the environment artists make those even nicer. Well, there's a lot of other tools here as well. One of the very first things you will, like if I were to go back to the point where I just have a cube, one of the things, after you have gotten the hang of just manipulating vertices and edges and faces, like one of the things that you may not have noticed is that you can actually select a edge with the scale tool, and you can scale an edge down or out to change the shape. So it's more than just, which you could do if with grabbing vertices and adjusting them. But what's nice about using scaling an edge like this is that it's going to do it evenly in both directions. And so you keep your symmetry much easier than if you're trying to like, all right, I grab this one and drag it out. And then I tried to drag this one out about the same amount. Like, yeah, you could do things to try to make that work. Oh, I could go into a, top-down view, isometric, and try to roughly line myself up with the grid. But sometimes there's, just like with computers and virtually anything in computers, there's always going to be multiple ways to do something, and some are easier than others. But if I go back to my cube, and then I go and select a face, one way, it's really smart to start out with the simplest possible object that is approximate to this thing that you're wanting to make, and kind of build up the complexity from there, rather than start with something really complex and try to control it. One very common thing that you're going to do is you're going to take a face and you're going to extrude it. So if I take this face and I just grab it, this is still just one face here. Now, if I right-click here, I get a menu that's relevant to the current selection. And down at the bottom, interestingly enough, is the most useful feature here when you're first learning, which is extrude faces. And so you'll see what happens is it kind of popped up. Now, you can drag this as you like, or you could have typed in the number, but you'll see the difference here compared to when I just pulled the face is that these are two different faces. So, and it can be a little bit easier to tell, for example, if we turn on this mode here, draw modes, and set shaded wireframe, because then we'll see that these are actually two separate two separate faces. So now I can operate on them differently. So if I, for example, if I were to select this face over here, control select that face over there, and then extrude again. All right, now I've got two arms. And if I take this face on top and I extrude it, I've got the start of a character, you know, and I can literally kind of build out an entire character by extruding faces and then maybe, like, for example, scaling them down. Maybe I want like this edge here to actually be thinner. So, and you can gradually, this is, like I said, the smart way to build up a model is to start with the simplest possible version and like extrude, get the really rough shape of what you're trying to make. And only add the additional complexity as you need it. So extrude, so you can control the distance here, or you can just drag it out. What you can do is you can, like for example, if you extrude multiple times from one object and extrude multiple times from another, you can combine those two separate things into one, and then you can create a bridge between them. So for example, I could, so if I were to delete this face, you see I now have like a gap here. And then I could have something else, and then I could select like edges or faces and then bridge them. Although you're starting to get into the kind of thing that it's going to be better to do in Blender when you're doing something that level of complex. But it is completely possible to do that. One of the other things that's really common to do in a more complex 3D program is to do what's called Boolean operations, where you'd say, all right, I'm going to take this object and I'm going to make these two intersect, and then I want this to cut out of this. You could use a shape to cut into another shape. There's an experimental feature in ProBuilder to do that. It almost always crashes Unity. So like I said, you're really quickly going to get to the point where you're going to find limitations.
When we were extruding, made me think about a giant worm like from Tube, and I was like, how would you create that?
Yeah.
You could connect it into one face, you could extrude this, but you would have to connect more faces.
And you could do a like if I started from a ProBuilder cylinder, for example, and then you can define in ProBuilder, actually here you can see that you can adjust the number of sides, which is going to make a much more smooth looking cylinder, but it adds a lot of geometry, a lot of complexity. But that, okay, now what I can do is I can take it and it's a little bit more tricky to select, like for example, all of these faces. Like I think that I can select, if I select that and then switch, some programs do that. I mean, you can, well, I think that what I can do is I can try to group select that. Now, what you'll notice is it didn't select the ones on the back side. If I wanted it to do that, there's actually one of these other buttons here. If I turn this on, it'll select what's on the other side. So if I were to say, okay, I select all of this, so I've got the top and this side, and then I can, I think maybe like control select these, and I get only the top. And so then I would do a extrude faces, and then I could make my worm by like, okay, when I rotate that, it makes things a little weird, but then, okay, and then I extrude it again. So you would, and you would do things to kind of like approximate the shape, and then of course it'd be a really good idea to look around at all points. A very common thing to do is to not realize, you think you've got this selecting on the far side thing turned on and you got it turned off. And so then you select something, for example, like if I were like, I'm going to select all of these Oh, okay, I'm moving that so that it's where I want it, and I'm rotating it. Okay, cool, it's going to look great. And then you look at the other side and you're like, wait a minute, I just mangled all this. Like it's not at the same place. And that's going to cause problems later. And that's because I wasn't selecting the far side hidden elements. But as I mentioned, when you're working with ProBuilder, you're really learning the basics, the fundamentals, the most important things. And so once you get to the point where you feel like, I understand working with ProBuilder, but I want to create more complex things, then you're ready to step up to Blender. But what will happen is you'll go into Blender, you're like, okay, how does Blender allow me to select things that are on the backside that are hidden? How does Blender extrude? For example, here, one of these other things you can do is if you select a face, for example, and then you do right click and bevel edge, you see it takes and creates, it kind of chops that so that it's more like, a pattern like this. And I could do the same if I get back to where I was, so I could bevel this as well. Well, you see, yeah, it's starting to create some pretty crazy geometry as well. But that's another, what I encourage you to do is what I call sketching or dabbling, which is like, go in without expecting to make something specific, just throw down some shapes and then see like, okay, well, like what are some of these things and how do they actually work? Like if you take this and use subdivide faces, you see now instead of that one face, I now have 4, which can be useful for certain things. Like if I'm like, okay, I want this to come to a point like this. But, I think that, rather than try to show you all this during class, because there's a couple of other things I want to show you after the break. It's, the majority of the things that you're going to work with, you can duplicate a face and just pull it off, and you could do that with a group of faces. So if I made something I really like and I want to like copy that, so that was a prime example of like, oh, what I wanted to do was to select all this. And I'm like, I just made the perfect arm. I don't want to have to remake the whole thing again. What I can do is I can, duplicate faces, and then I've got a perfect copy of the geometry that I just made. And so one of the things that you're going to hear as you start to work with 3D is what they call topology, which is essentially just means where the cuts are, where the edges and the faces and the vertices are. And in the beginning, you could ignore that. But when you get to the point of trying to make like a 3D character, it really matters how the lines run on the character. And because if you're trying to take an arm and bend it in this way, if you've got the perfect topology, it'll all look good. But if you can make something that looks identical, but instead of the lines running as you'd hope they would, they're running a different way. It makes the same shape, but when you try to bend that, then those edges and things, they don't bend nicely, and you get pieces poking out all over the place. So just know, in the beginning, don't worry about topology, but eventually it's going to matter. And so you're going to start to care about like where I actually put things. All right, well, during the break, one of the things I did was I brought up something that I built in ProBuilder just recently to kind of take it for a test drive. And it's because I wanted to show you a trick that is useful not just in ProBuilder, but this is something that 3D artists do a whole lot, which is using actual reference. So you'll see here that if I were to hide this stuff, what I have here is I have a 2D image that I found on the internet of a helicopter, and I put it on a plane and put it in my scene. And when I look at it, looking down the z-axis, like, a lot of times when you're working as a 3D artist, what happens is concept artists give you a front and a side view of something. And what you're essentially doing is you're essentially kind of tracing in 3D over the top of this thing. And so, what I can do here is that I can, select vertices and edges and whatnot, and just kind of move them to get them to the places that, I want them to, so that they line up with this reference. And so using reference like that can allow you to, like, if I'm like, okay, if I were to continue building out this thing here in the back, like, what do I have? I've got I might want to select these two faces and then like extrude them. And yeah, that came out pretty crazy because of like which is probably means that I probably should have done this earlier on, like got a better rough shape first. But it's the kind of thing that you can massage and get to the point where you're like, okay, of course you want to use the isometric view here. And when you're selecting, for example, these vertices, you want to make sure you have that select the backside thing on. So I'm like, okay, if I get this to roughly here, another thing I could do is I could change it. Well, if I change it to wireframe, then I don't see my my reference. But so what I would probably do is just kind of make it so that this is smaller than the area that I'm trying to approximate. Say like, okay, if I line that up like this, line that up roughly like this, maybe these things, I could select the this thing between them, and this global versus local thing that we've seen before should actually work better than that. And then when I look at it from this side, I'm like, well, obviously that doesn't look correct. So I look at it from this side and I say, okay, these need to come in here. This needs to come in here. But if you think of it kind of like digital sculpting, so now if I remove, hide the side reference temporarily, I start to get a sense for like, okay, that looks all right. And so, this is something that, I recommend you give a try is to, it's not terribly hard, to go on the internet and say like, like teddy bear side view, and then you're like, all right, cool. Like, here's something that, you might even get like a nice, matching side view and front view, turn around. Like, so here's an example of like, like real kind of, game assets that have that kind of shape. And you see how they even have like the arms are disconnected so that it's easier to see how to create the arms separately from the rest of the body. And so this is a great way to learn. Like, I wouldn't go jump to doing something, like a character immediately. But like, for example, if you were to do like something, a bird. Mm-hmm. So like, let's see, bird side view. And then, you might even say like, vector drawing, and then you get something like this. Why is it opening like that now? That's kind of weird. I guess if I go to images, maybe it'll stop. Weird. So then you're like, of course, like there's actually two types of modeling that's common when we talk about 3D modeling. There's what we call hard surface modeling, which is like that boxy, like, airplane or a tank or something like that. And then there's, more like the soft modeling, or like, the, character modeling and things that have really organic shapes. Of course, something like this is going to, in order to look smooth and nice, it's going to require a lot more kind of finesse. Although there is a trick that you can do even here in ProBuilder, which I'll show you. So you see that like things look really facety. It looks like you can see all the triangles and all the, all the, granted, if I put here in the shading mode, one of these draw modes, it looks a little better, but you're like, wow, there's still these really hard edges where things meet. Sometimes you want that, like you're making like, a crate, or like, an AT-AT from Star Wars or something like that. But sometimes you want something to look smooth. And there's actually a way to do that using ProBuilder, which is that you can look at the difference between this actually and this. So you see they're exactly the same model, but one of them is using what we call smoothing groups. This one on the bottom, you can see that it's mostly smooth, except right here where the body intersects with this portion. Whereas this, all of those faces are pretty kind of harsh, and so the difference here is that on this model, if you go to Tools, ProBuilder, I think it's Editors, Open Smoothing Editor, which is this thing. So if I get into my face select mode, you'll see that this thing has a bunch of numbers. And what those numbers allow me to do, let me actually, instead of selecting this thing, let me select this body here. So now, when I select, go into this, the editing mode, select faces, any of the faces that I select, if I click on a group number and make them part of a smoothing group, you'll see there was a subtle change right there. Now, if I come out of here, you'll see now they look smooth. And so the way that I get, you kind of figure out like, okay, well, I do want some creases, I do want some hard edges. So for example, with this helicopter, I made this whole body part of a smoothing group, but this is a separate smoothing group, and so is this. That's how I got this hard edge here and this hard edge here. So smoothing groups, if you want to make kind of like a soft organic shape, like, a bird or a teddy bear, chances are, you'll take, your model, and if I go into face select, I select all the faces, and then I double check, yeah, I got the backside as well, and make them all part of one smoothing group, then, they all get smoothed together. And I look at it without the wireframe. Actually, I have to come out of this. Then you'll see how smooth that is. Another thing that could be useful about smoothing groups is the fact that you can also right-click on this to select smoothing groups. So if I said, this is one group, make that group 2, I'm working over here, I'm like, oh, I want to grab all the number 2s. If I right-click, you see it even tells you, then it'll select that group. So you can also use it as for doing selection. So that's smoothing groups, and those are under Tools, ProBuilder, Editors, Smoothing Editor. So now, probably the one other thing that could be really cool to do, and for this I'm going to go back to the other model that I was working on. Let's see, is that one of the ways that you can add color to your models in a really quick and easy way. So for example, if I create, a ProBuilder cube again, bring it out here and look at it. A quick and easy way to add color is by using something called vertex colors, which is, you've seen previously that we would add color to an object, for example, by creating a material. And say, okay, I create a material, and then I apply that material to this thing. Did that actually work? Let's see. Yep. And so, because of this that I saw those lines. So that's a totally legitimate way of adding colors using material, but you don't have to use material. You can actually take that cube, the one that for some reason I named We, interesting. There's a trick for adding color, not just to an object in its entirety, but actually to specific faces, and it's something called vertex colors. And vertex colors are programmatic. They're created in code, and so they don't use materials. But if I go to ProBuilder, Editors, Vertex Color Editor, and it put it over here. You get this cool thing, which it's kind of pretty. You can put it over here on the side and kind of, so it gives you a color palette, and you can, you can add to these or use these colors. But what's cool is if I get into my face select, I select a face, and then I just click apply, and then I click off of it, I get that color on that face. So my cube here could have a different color on each of these faces. And I can rotate around and say, okay, this face is going to be yellow. And so we've added color to this thing using vertex colors. And so, that's like, for example, if you were creating your gray box or whatever, and you had an entirely gray scene, but you wanted to draw attention to, like, the climbing grips that the player is going to use, or some important gameplay thing, if you're already using ProBuilder, it's really quick and easy to go ahead and use the tools here to add color to things. So I'm going to give you a moment to just kind of experiment with adding color to the 3D objects that you're creating using vertex colors. And then if you also want to try out the smoothing groups, you're welcome to try that as well. And I'm here to help. And of course, Linnea is here as well. Cool. So one of the things I wanted to do is conclude with a little bit about material and texture, because that's something that you can also do here. So you can color with the with vertex colors, but you also have the ability to add and manipulate textures using ProBuilder. So something to know about working with textures is that we talked about topology. Topology is like the lines and how they run across a 3D model. And those are actually pretty important when it also comes to a texture, because what happens is, in order to apply a texture to a 3D model, a texture is flat. Generally you're working with a 2D texture. But then a 3D model is not flat, it's three-dimensional. And so the way that you apply a texture to a 3D model is that you kind of unwrap the 3D object. So for example, here's a cube. If we unwrap it so that it's 2D, you'd get this. You get the 6 sides of this. Or for example, if you take this character, if you peel their skin off and flatten it out as much as you can, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, how do we map a 2D texture to a 3D model? And you can see, if you do it well, if your topology is right, then the majority of your model has this checker pattern, and that means that the texture is going to be relatively correct and relatively well laid out. But there will be places where it kind of gets stretched. So you can see some places where it starts to get a little bit like, okay, it's not exact, the crown of the head here, it's the texture there is gonna look a little bit stretched in this direction. And that's why artists often use this checker pattern to see, is my texture gonna look proper? If they're roughly, sometimes you don't mind the stretching, but what you're hoping for is that the majority of stuff, you can see underneath the arm there, you're gonna have a very stretched texture across here. And so this 2D representation of that 3D skin is called a UV map. It's called UV because that's the coordinates instead of X and Y, so that you don't get confused with X and Y coordinates on a 3D model. It uses U and V. U is one dimension, V is the other dimension. And so, you kind of need to get a sense for how your 3D model might unwrap and how the texture will then be applied to it. And it used to be really difficult to figure these things out and line them up. But now there's a lot of tools that let you do this. Like in Blender, you can actually make adjustments right there and see the effects. And as you move around, you can select these points and these edges and faces on the UVs the same way you do here. And if you move them around, you'll move that point's position on the texture and it'll appear different on the model. So it'll help for us to take a look at this actually in ProBuilder. But what we're going to need is we're going to need some textures. So what we're going to do first is have you go on the asset store and search for texture, but then make sure that you choose the free option so that you find some free textures to work with. And the other trick here is to watch out for the download size. So for example, if I search for textures, and then under filters, I choose the price free, I'm going to get some recommendations for different textures here. You know, oh, these free stylized textures are pretty cool and they're free. If I open that up, and then I kind of want to double check that the file size isn't ginormous. So like if this file size is like 5 gigabytes, then you're probably not going to download it before the class is over. So it's a good idea to like make sure you're not downloading something humongous. But otherwise, if you, for example, find something like this that'll work for our purposes, click, you'll need to be logged in, and you'll click Add to My Assets, and then it'll say Open up in Unity. All right, and so yeah, now you see it says Open in Unity, and when I do, it opens up the package manager and automatically brings that up in here. And now I can click first to download it, and it'll take a second to download. And we see there's a progress bar. And then once it's done, this download button will change to an import button, and we'll click import, and then it'll show us, hey, these are the things I'm going to bring into your project. So here, now I can say import 1.0 to project. And it shows me like, here's all the things that we're going to bring into your project, which is fine. There's nothing extra fluff or anything like that. It's a bunch of materials, the textures that are on the materials, and then a scene that's like a demo scene. So that's fine. Now I click import. Note that when you do this, you have downloaded that package onto your computer. And if you do this a lot, you'll wind up with tons of that stuff on your computer, and you actually have to go in and find it and delete it or remove it, not just from the Unity projects that you're using, but from like Unity's download area. So, it will eventually start eating up quite a bit of space. Unreal is way worse about this kind of stuff. So once you have it in there, you'll want to look in your projects. So for example, for me, it added this low poly folder that has this free stylized folder in it and has materials and textures. And if I use the slider here, I can see previews of the textures and the materials. And if it's pink, then that means we have to do one more thing, which is, you'll probably encounter this a lot, which is like sometimes you wind up with materials that are made for a different render pipeline, like the default render pipeline, or we use URP, you might get HDRP. There's actually when you see this, if you download assets and you see the dreaded fuchsia color, if you go to Window, Rendering, Render Pipeline Converter, then Unity actually built it. This happens so often that they built a tool for this. So leave it, built into URP. Then you can go ahead and select everything here. Technically, you probably don't have to worry about the animation clips. And then click Initialize and Convert. It's going to ask me about saving the scene, and then it starts running through this. I get this a lot with other asset packs that I've downloaded, like Cinti or other things. It's because at one point when they were created for like the built-in render pipeline, and now they are being updated. So you see now my materials no longer have that pink on them, and I can see what I'm looking at.
How did you open that window again?
I'd be glad to show you. So it's under Window, Rendering, Render Pipeline Converter. And that's just something that you're probably going to do so many times after you've worked with importing other packages from other places that it'll eventually stick. but like at first you'll forget about it. But yeah, this is one of the more commonly used tools that especially since a lot of assets were created years ago when it was more common to use the built-in render pipeline. Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. So sometimes it will kind of show you automatic, like it will detect that, but not always exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so for example, like, if we take a texture and I throw it onto, one of my objects here. Uh, so you can just grab a material and throw it onto an object. If you click on the material, you'll see over here in the inspector, you've got a preview down here at the bottom that I'm going to hide for now. And then if you look here under surface inputs, you have tiling. So if I bump this up to like 10 by 10, it gets really super duper tiny. If I go more fractional, like 0.5, or let's see, 0.5 to 0.5, it gets smaller. And you can actually put your cursor over on the X or the Y and click and drag to adjust those, in real time. And if you want, they could be different. A lot of times you want them to be the same. But, if you want it to be like, if you want it to be super large, super small value. If you want it to be really tiny, really big value. So now if I zoom in there, you can see. So that tiling, now note, because that's a property on the material, like a lot of times you're using one material for multiple different objects. And if you adjust that on the material, it's going to affect all the objects that use that material. So if you want to have different scaling, but the same material, you would duplicate the material and say, okay, this one is, has a different scale than the other. But then, you might wind up putting, like if I look at this and then you can see like, oh, wow, like, there's parts of this that looks okay, but then there's parts of it that are super stretched out, and maybe places where like you can tell there's a seam. And so the problem that's happening there is a UV problem, basically. But we can actually edit UVs using one of the ProBuilder tools. There's the UV editor. So we go ProBuilder, editors, open UV editor. So you get this, I'll dock it here because it's a fairly big thing, but you can see, actually I probably want this where I can see them side by side. And of course, this is a situation where multiple monitors can help quite a lot too. But so now I can see, like, I have my UVs showing up over here. And I think, let's see, so if I select my object, there we see them. So with the object selected, I can see I've got a mess of UVs that are all kind of like overlapping each other. But I think that what I can do is I can select a face here. So the face that I've selected in this 3D view is now highlighted here. And if I were to move over here and I were to, for example, if I click that same shortcut for selection or for move. So for example, over here, I can do WER, to switch between these three. And then if I don't see this gizmo here, if I press W, I'll see it. But now when I move this, you'll see that it actually changes how the texture appears over here. So now getting the hang of getting UVs set up and aligned correctly can take you time and effort to figure out. So I'm not going to go real deep into it here, but the point is that you can try to line things up better by adjusting, their position or even their scale over here. And I believe things like edge selection should also work the same, which is like, okay, now I'm moving just an edge of this UV rather than the entire face. And so I think the most important thing to do is just to play around with this to get a sense for how UVs relate to the 3D objects, and how you might take and say like, okay, if I come over here and I said this thing is really stretched out, is there anything I can do to fix that? I can say, okay, well, maybe if I instead am trying to select points, like if I move around this point, let's see, that's the thing that, like, how does that affect the model? And can I start to kind of smooth out, like, okay, look, when it was here, it was really stretched out, but now when I bring it back over to here, it's starting to look more like what I want. Like there, that's weird. Why did it? I'm not sure why it's not letting me move that vertex that keeps popping back over here. Maybe because it's like overlapping. Maybe I'm going the wrong direction, or maybe it's just buggy. Like I said, at some point you're going to graduate from ProBuilder and start focusing more on Blender. But that's the basic. I mean, there's lots of other tools here in terms of being able to select and move things around. And of course, as I mentioned, you have the same ability to work with vertices, edges, or faces. And you can select them here and see them in the 3D model, or you could do it vice versa, where you're selecting on the 3D model and you're seeing the faces or whatever you have selected on the UV. So any questions about what you've seen so far? Like, I know it's a lot of new stuff to throw at you, and you're probably going to need a little bit of time to play around with it to see how it works in a practical sense. But anything that comes to mind immediately? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that you're not seeing, so you see the texture here, but actually this texture effectively repeats, infinitely in other areas, and you can actually take and select a UV and actually move it off of. Let's see. You can just move it here so it's not overlapping. So like that might be one of the first things you do, is you're just like, okay, I can't handle everything overlapping. And so you'll notice that even when you move it off of the texture, that you still see texture on that thing. And so you can actually, and there are sometimes when you look at the UVs, they are nicely unwrapped, like with a cube. In this case, they were all kind of jumbled up on top of each other. And it's quite possible that there is maybe a way to like automatically spread them out. Let's see. Or that, otherwise, what you can also do is just pull them off yourself and get them kind of organized in a way that helps you make sense of what you're looking at, or at least not be all jumbled on top of each other. But yeah, essentially this material here repeats, and it would almost be nice to see that spread out so that you could, I mean, I'm like, is there some, so that's showing me the texture or not. So you can switch between manual and auto. Oh, let's see. I mean, to be honest, I haven't played with. I'm actually trying to learn Blender more now. I haven't played with ProBuilder enough to know where these things are at. But yeah, like I would wonder if we have just a regular cube. So yeah, it is putting all the UVs kind of on top of each other. So if I were to pull these out, I would be able to see all the UVs and not have them overlapping. But you'd almost wonder, is there a way to have that happen automatically? Like when I went to school so long ago, like a lot of this stuff was stuff that we had to do manually by hand, and now there's really smart tools that make it automatic. You can push a button and it just unwraps things nicely. Or even, you have tools like ZBrush and others that you actually paint directly onto the model, and you're not even trying to translate, okay, how does this point in this 2D thing, where does that appear on the 3D thing? Instead, you're just like, I have this model, and I'm going to paint over here, and I'm going to paint over here, which works really great for organic stuff. And so the whole world of 3D modeling, and like I mentioned, you can have a very different experience if you're like a hard surface modeler who makes like vehicles and weapons and like buildings and such, compared to somebody who's doing more organic shapes, characters, or like natural things. And it's often a very different process depending. Like what I've shown you so far is much more relevant for like hard surface modeling, building a house, building something like with hard edges. But there's lots of interesting tools like ZBrush and Mudbox, and there's some great tools actually on iPad that you can do a lot of cool stuff with sculpting and stuff like that. So to close, let's see. I think I got some homework for you here. So we went over a bit about the tiling of textures and moving the UVs around. I showed you a bit about using reference, which you can set up, if you want a tutorial on how to set up, if you have any trouble setting up something like this in Unity and you want me to do a quick video tutorial for you, just mention it. I'd be glad to cook something up. Here's an example of that same kind of approach in Maya, and how especially like you can very often find like CAD drawings or other kind of like blueprints or specifications or characters, and it can be really useful to set them up from multiple directions. And so as you look at them from different directions, you start to set them up. So use ProBuilder to create a gray box level or improve on the level from class 2. I'm also okay if you just want to create like a character or an object as well. Basically, I want you to develop more complex 3D objects than what you've done up to this point using ProBuilder. Use vertex colors to give significance to relevant objects. And then as a bonus, if you add in either a third or first person controller so you can walk around your scene and look at it. You see this isometric city. This was built entirely in ProBuilder. Especially when you see it in an isometric camera and zoomed out, like it almost looks like something you would see in like a mobile game. But somebody just built that, probably in an afternoon using ProBuilder, duplicating things and extruding and using a lot of those kind of built-in tricks. So yeah, that's it.